Folks, this is my 20th year of podcasting. I've had an absolute blast doing it. I might even start a Patreon to get some of my old episodes back online. But you know what? The one thing that has really meant a lot to me throughout all my years is that now I have friends everywhere. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. And it's true, because of the podcast, I have friends everywhere, but it's also kind of related to the episodes that we're talking about today in Andor Season 2, Episodes 4 through 6, which is the focus of today's episode with our guest writer, Beau Willimon. For those of you who think Beau's name sounds familiar, it's true. He is the creator of the American version of House of Cards, and he did a fantastic job on that. And he has done a fantastic job writing on Andor, both seasons 1 and 2. And you know, our format is always spoiler-free first, so if you haven't seen these particular episodes, it's okay to tune in until we make a very clear spoiler announcement. And in our spoiler-free section, you'll find out what Beau's connection is with showrunner and creator of Andor, Tony Gilroy, because it actually predates Andor. Look, Beau is a very talented writer who is very forthcoming about his creative process and what it took to get these episodes of Andor made, so I know you'll dig this episode. And folks, I want to talk about today's sponsor for a second. It's Final Draft's Big Break Screenwriting Contest, which has a regular deadline of May 19th, 2025. You can enter now for the possibility to share in over $80,000 in cash and prizes. Winners and finalists have signed with agents and managers, sold and optioned screenplays, and been staffed in TV writers' rooms. All you got to do is ask yourself, is this the year for your big break? Find out more by visiting finaldraft.com to enter. And while you're surfing around online, I hope you also stop over at Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net or via our iPad app, Backstory. Folks, this is our 13th year, and we couldn't have done it without you, so I really hope you'll test drive us by reading the free issue of Backstory Magazine over there. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, I hope you consider becoming a subscriber. And to sweeten the deal, here's a discount coupon code that will save you $5 off a one-year subscription. Just type in SAVE5 over at backstory.net to complete your subscription, and you'll save $5 off. There's a ton of great articles there, and we always keep adding to our current issues, so there's always new stuff as well. And look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these Zoomcasts. That's right, you could see Beau and I talking in the Zoomcast over on our YouTube page. But it would really mean a lot to me to have you consider supporting independent entertainment journalism. So thanks for considering becoming a Backstory subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our interview with screenwriter Beau Willimon about Andor Season 2, Episodes 4 through 6, which you could watch right now on Disney+. Beau, it's good to see you. How you doing?
Great to see you, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to have you on the podcast. We've had you in Backstory Magazine before, and I want to give our listeners out there just a sense of who you are and from whence doth you hail. I know that you graduated with a History and Visual Arts degree from Columbia, then you returned to Columbia for an MFA, and you began writing and went to Juilliard as well. I'm curious what you could tell us that was really informative about your path to becoming a writer. If there were any light bulb moments, I love hearing about them when you kind of were able to see things more clearly. Because I know that you've told other people, and I think in our magazine before, when you first started out, you felt like you were stumbling a lot as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, I think light bulb moments only illuminate for you in retrospect. You sort of look back at the moments in your life that you realize many years later were formative. There's two that I really had to point to looking back. One would be when I was in high school. There's a great monologue at Spalding Gray. If people have never seen Swimming to Cambodia, a great Jonathan Demme film, it was just an extraordinary monologuist. And it turns out that his niece was a good friend of mine in high school, and his brother was married to my principal. I was really interested in the theater in high school. And Liz one day said to me, I guess we were about 16, hey, my uncle's coming to perform at Washington University. Do you want to come see him do a monologue? And I was like, well, what is that? What is that all about? All I had really seen on the stage was traveling roadshow musicals. And she said, just come and check it out. And saw him perform Grey's Anatomy at the Edison Theater. And for anyone who doesn't know Spalding Gray, what he did, he came out of the avant-garde theater scene in the 70s in New York, 60s and 70s, the Wooster Group. That's like, Willem Dafoe and Kate Valk and Liz Lecomte. And all you would ever have was a wooden table on a stage, a glass of water, and some notes. And he would proceed to tell a monologue in direct conversation with the audience that could evoke an entire galaxy, universe, just with the human body, the voice, and a sort of passionate belief that you can conjure with those few elements enough to create something that is cinematic. It's why Jonathan Demme felt like he could make a film of just one of these monologues without many bells and whistles. I remember being so blown away by it. I became obsessed with Spalding Gray. I ended up interning at the Wooster Group in New York, and I knew that somewhere in my heart there was something to that had really sort of jolted me. It was years later that I arrived at writing itself. I was much more facile as a painter, but I think what I found in writing was an ability to I always painted narratively. I wanted to tell stories, and in writing was the opportunity to think about a moving frame, a non-static image, stories in flesh and blood. And I go back, I'm like, oh, from those very simple elements, even when you get to operate on a huge canvas like Andor, where you have so many possibilities at your disposal and it's such large scale, fundamentally, and this goes straight to how Tony wanted to approach this project from day one, it is character. It is the words people say that are born of deep emotion and personal relationships and conflict and passion, which drives everything. And that's, I think, what really sparked for me with Spalding Gray. And I return to that all the time whenever I feel stuck. Just go to the fundamentals. And the other moment, which really quickly, is when I was in college, I was a huge fan of the Beat Poets. I got to see Allen Ginsberg perform some of his poetry when I was first year at Columbia. It was less than a year before he died. And he was sick and he was feeble, but it was a room of rapt students listening to this, sage, this Yoda. He really was like a Yoda. And I got to briefly meet him. And afterwards, he took my hand and, he said, how was the reading? And I was like, it was amazing. He's like, I felt a little under the weather. Did my voice get to the back of the room? And I was like, this is extraordinary. This guy was like a god to me. And yet it was a very human moment where he just wanted to make sure he delivered for the audience still, after accomplishing everything he had. And I think that the bravery it takes to put yourself out there and the vulnerability and the humility that's required, both the ego and egolessness of it, is a great reminder. That's a fundamental thing of being a writer too. So I think those were two pivotal moments for me that I really can only appreciate many years later.
Those are absolutely fantastic. And you cannot pick two better people to focus on than Allen Ginsberg and Spalding Gray. And for anybody that hasn't seen Jonathan Demme's basically live performance shoot of Swimming to Cambodia with Sharks, please go see it. Because like solo performance artists taking over theaters was a great movement. I would also throw in Eric Bogosian as a great part of that movement, you could see, I guess they filmed Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll was his one-man show that I think they put to film. And then Oliver Stone took his one-man show of talk radio and made a movie.
I got to see him do talk radio on stage, which was amazing. And I'll briefly just add, the great Jonathan Demme, of course, who, like a Soderbergh, was able to sort of go from mainstream big Hollywood films to like avant-garde stuff. I had the great pleasure of my producing partner and I helped produce a small film of his, one of his last, called A Master Builder, with the great Wally Shawn and Andre Gregory, based on the Ibsen play. And I got to go to his editing room in Nyack, New York, and sit with him and watch a rough cut, which is one of the sort of, cherished memories I have of getting to meet a hero. A Spalding Gray and a Jonathan Demme colliding in a cinematic and storytelling way, to me, is like, that's the zenith of like what's possible with the fewest ingredients,
Yeah, great well for creativity there. You had worked with politicians, you had the experience. Just briefly before we get to Andor, and I'm going, because there is an Andor connection to all this, but I want to ask this question first. You wrote the excellent play Farragut North, which was adapted into 2011's The Ides of March, which you were Oscar nominated for writing, which in turn led to you adapting the 1990 British TV show House of Cards based on the novel. For America, you took it across the pond, and we could spend many podcasts talking about that. And on House of Cards, that was when, to my knowledge, you first worked with Tony Gilroy, the showrunner of Andor, because you were the showrunner of House of Cards, and Tony was a consulting producer producer. I'm just curious if there was, again, I hate to just tag it like this, but a light bulb moment, because it's not easy to adapt something politically from overseas into the American stratosphere. And you did it so deftly and made the changes that you needed to. And it could seem impenetrable because obviously, like, 20 years or so had already gone by the time you were adapting it. Was there a moment when you saw your way in? Because a lot of writers on an adaptation, they're always looking for that way in. And I'm curious if you remember what that was. And then I definitely want to hear about working with Tony on the show.
I had worked on a few political campaigns prior to writing Farragut North. I had worked on a couple Senate campaigns and a presidential campaign in college, and then worked on Howard Dean's campaign after I finished graduate school. And that came out of nothing more than wanting to, in some small way, contribute to change, to try to get people elected that I believed in. I wasn't trying to amass material for a play. It was coming out of pure idealism and youthful adrenaline. And when I wrote that play, it was an attempt to, I think, grapple with a pretty big blow to me, emotionally, which was Howard Dean's campaign imploding. And I really believed this guy was going to be the next president of the United States and change the world, And so I wrote that play. At first, no one was really that interested in doing the play. And to make a long story short, it found its way into the right hands and some big movie stars got involved and suddenly a lot of doors opened for me. But when I was approached about House of Cards, I wasn't necessarily keen on going back to that well. I felt I had already done it with Farragut North, and I knew the movie was in the works, but it was David Fincher. And of course, I wasn't going to turn down the opportunity to at least speak with the great David Fincher. But I kind of a little bit was, maybe I'll watch the British series and I won't have any good ideas, or I'll get on the phone with David and we won't click, and then I don't have to go down this path again. But when I watched the British series, there's a catchphrase that Francis Urquhart in the Great British series has, which is, you very well might think that I couldn't possibly comment. And it felt imperative that that catchphrase exist as an homage in any adaptation, but I couldn't for the life of me think about what American speaks that way. You very well might think that I couldn't possibly comment. And then I did have a little eureka moment, which is my dad was from South Carolina. If you put a Southern accent on it, you can get language to a heightened place. This is going to be a bad version, but you very well might think that I couldn't possibly comment. That sounds like it could exist in this world.
Right.
As soon as I had that idea, I thought, well, okay, now this guy is from South Carolina. Unlike the Francis Urquhart, who came from a place of privilege and aristocracy, the American mythology is you come from nothing. So, our Frank will come from nothing, come from South Carolina, and something starts to build, and layer up. And, then you start thinking, how do you take out Parliament, put in Congress? But really the first moment I felt like there was a path in was just trying to figure out a very simple kind of dumb problem, which is, how do I keep this catchphrase in there? And I think oftentimes that's where good writing comes from, is really simple, seemingly dumb places. A good example of that is the prison arc in season 1 of Andor, where we had to layer it up over time, but initially just started kind of from a contrarian place of, especially for Tony and Dan, who had done a million thrillers and prison breakouts and all sorts. You're like, we know we want to do a prison thing, but how do we do it different? How do we make it interesting for ourselves? How do we do a prison that's like an anti-prison? Like, how do you do a prison where there's no guns? How do you do a prison where there's no bars? It was like just trying to solve those kind of dumb problems of how to make it interesting for ourselves. And then a more sophisticated idea starts to evolve, And it's precisely that sort of thinking that made me want to, ask Tony to be a consulting producer for a couple seasons of House of Cards. So I'll segue into that, because the way I actually met Tony was, I was a huge fan of the great legendary screenwriter William Goldman. And when I was first starting out, I essentially cold emailed him. I had a way to reach him. I wanted to organize a retrospective of his films, because retrospectives for screenwriters are almost never done. And if anyone deserved it, I felt like he did. I mean, you're talking about Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, HUD, Marathon Man, All the President's Men, The Princess Bride, Misery, on and on. And it took a while to convince Bill Goldman to say yes. It took a number of lunches and going to his apartment and chatting with what movies would you choose? And when I finally got him to say yes, yes, I was having trouble getting some of the New York art houses to agree to host this. I mean, I went to IFC and to MoMA and to Walter Reed and to Film Forum and, all the places you would expect would leap at this. And I was getting some pushback because I think they felt Bill Goldman was too Hollywood. Like if I want to do like a silent German expressionist,
right.
they would be like, great, I get it. Programmers can be territorial and they put a lot of effort into, their programming. But I was like, I could get you Robert Redford. I can get you like cool people to show up and like, Dustin Hoffman and all these people to celebrate these modern classics. But I was really embarrassed because I thought, well, how am I going to actually pull this off if I can't get a theater for it? Agent of mine suggested I speak to Tony Gilroy, who was a protege of Bill's. Maybe Tony would have some ideas. So I spoke to Tony and said, well, why don't you, contact Jane Rosenthal at the Tribeca Film Festival and see if they can arrange something for you. And I knew Jane a little bit, and I did. And they couldn't devote multiple screens, but they were able to organize a 40th anniversary screening of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid outdoors on the Hudson River for like 3,000 people.
That's awesome.
And Tony Gilroy, Aaron Sorkin, Scott Frank, and David Koepp to all come and speak because they were all proteges. And as a result of that, I became friends with Tony and stayed in touch with him. When we were going into season 3 of House of Cards, David Fincher, who had been extremely involved, was starting to focus on Gone Girl. It was taking up a lot of his oxygen. I couldn't bank on David being available as much as I needed him to be to give notes on scripts. So I thought, who can kick my ass as well as David Fincher can? Because you need that 35,000-foot view when you're in the bubble to make sure that another chef is tasting the food before it goes out. And I called Tony and I said, look, you can tell me to shut up halfway through the sentence if it's not for you. I can't pay you Tony Gilroy money. I don't have the budget for that. Would you consider reading one draft per episode as a consulting producer and kick my ass? And he said, well, wait, you'll pay me to learn how to write television? And I was like, yeah, Tony, I have a lot to teach you on how to write anything. But he was like, look, sure, this sounds like fun. And he did it. And not only, he read almost every draft of every episode and would give me thoughts and notes, which was extremely valuable because you're moving so fast. You don't have a lot of time for reflection. And you're so in it. And it was just a joy working with Tony. And he became a real mentor to me beyond just a collaborator. And so, when Andor came around, at one point he said, hey, how would you feel about writing a few episodes of Andor? And I thought he was joking at first because it wasn't an obvious thing. Like it's not, people weren't thinking of me for Star Wars stuff. And he's like, no, I'm serious. I'm like, Tony, I'm not a deep aficionado. Like I grew up with Star Wars. I love Star Wars, but I don't know the deep canon, all that. And he was like, great. The less you know, the better. Let me and Lucasfilm worry about that. I want you and my brother in there because, we need to move fast and I believe in you guys. And my main focus is the human story that we're telling at the center of it. That's what we got to crack. It sounded like fun. And I had never worked on someone else's show. So it was great because I felt like I got to be a session musician on someone else's album, and come in and play a little bit of bass and not have to worry about all the showrunner stuff that eats up so much of your time and energy when it's your own show. Yeah. And it's just a blast working on it.
What's fascinating about it is that basically when it comes down to it, you had this long-term TV experience for House of Cards, which was your first TV experience, and Andor is Tony's first TV experience, and he wanted to kind of rewire what it could be. And I would just love to hear from you because we've heard from Tony about how he put the room together and how it worked, but he was saying things that just like are mind-boggling, saying that like everybody met at a hotel for 6 days to break Andor season 1, and he said he did the same thing for season 2, and then he would send folks off for about 6 weeks to write their script and that they would turn in the script. Just starting there, is that true? Is that your memory of it? Was there more time, less time, or?
That's exactly how it happened. We met in the Lucasfilm rented out top floor of the Soho Grand. Dan Gilroy flew in for season 1, stayed at the hotel. I lived in New York and Tony lived in New York, so we'd commute to work in the morning. And I have a bunch of whiteboards at my office. And Tony, when he said, I want to do a room to break the story, I was like, look, how many weeks are we talking about here? He's like, 1 week. We got 1 week. We have to move fast. This was pre-pandemic and Lucasfilm wanted to move super fast. And I was like, you're crazy. Break a whole series. He's like, well, I got a Bible. I have have some architecture. I was like, man, I don't care how much architecture you have. You're talking, a few episodes a day. And he's like, well, I just kind of want to get in there and get the broad strokes, and then we'll go off and outline and write, and we'll make it happen. I was like, okay, how do you want to structure the room? Like, I usually have whiteboards and I'm kind of drawing a grid and, kind of breaking episodes and putting it in. He's like, okay. He's like, we could have some whiteboards if you want. I'm like, no, it's your show. I was like, I'll tell you what, let me get a couple whiteboards in there. So we got a man with the van, my assistant brought a couple whiteboards over to the hotel, and the three of us sat at the table, and we would have, Sana Wallenberg was there, Luke Hole showed up a bit, and my assistant was taking notes. We didn't start from scratch. Tony already had a pilot episode, and he had written a pretty sizable, extensive Bible where so much of it was mapped out, but there were huge gaps. I mean, there were, like, for instance, the whole prison thing wasn't anywhere in that, as an example. And we just dove in, and it was sort of like a fever dream where Tony had sort of set the table so expertly that, like, Dan and I then could just kind of dive in and work with him, sort of facilitate him working his way through his vision. And the first thing he said when we got in the room is season 1 is the education of Cassian Andor.
Yeah.
That we're going to take someone who is starting off from the most, selfish, outsider place and get him to a point by the end of the season where he's willing to completely devote himself to this project that is the rebellion. So that's quite an arc that dictates certain kind of things that have to happen in a dramatic sense and an emotional sense along the way. And because he had all of these sort of characters worked out, the Dedras and the Cyrils and all the people on Ferrix and so on, all we had to do was sort of activate it, and then best idea won, and it was Tony, it's his show, he was clearly in charge, but there was really no ego in that room. And I think, half the things we couldn't even, remember who came up with what. It was just obvious when something felt right. And so, yeah, we worked through a couple episodes a day. And we had, a couple hundred pages worth of notes at the end. And then we went off to do outlines where our episodes that we were assigned, we would write out outlines, run them past Tony, he'd give notes. And then, we ran them past the powers that be to make sure everything was copacetic. And then we were off to the races writing the episodes. Then we'd get notes on those and all of this remotely, and then eventually turn it over to Tony, who would, of course, do his pass, or passes along the way. And that's how season 1 came together. I mean, I remember working on, the season 2, we had 2 weeks. It felt like a luxury compared to season 1. It was the same thing at the Soho Grand. Dan was Zooming in because of COVID at the time, and Tom Bissell had joined, and Tom is great. And then I remember when I was working on outlines and scripts for season 2, I did much of that work in Ukraine. I was working on a documentary in Ukraine. I've made about 10 trips there since the war began. And I didn't tell Tony that I was in Ukraine, but he kept getting this weird foreign number when I called to talk about it. And finally he's like, where are you? Because when we were working in the room on season 2 was just before the invasion. And so we were talking about it a lot. And then I was there, and he was like, are you in friggin' Ukraine? And I was like, yeah, I am. I can say that there's some elements of my experience in Ukraine which certainly informed the block of episodes that I was working on.
I would assume the Gorman stuff.
Yeah, I mean, just a place where there's a great deal of, the air is crackling with the pressure of the given circumstances. I'm trying to be sort of circumspect at how.
Yeah, like the resistance. I mean, like they're trying to figure out a way to protect themselves from a fascist power taking over. That's what Ukraine's all about, unfortunately. What year would you say that was when you were there working on season 2?
Well, I mean, it would have been February 2022 was when the war began. Right? Sort of mid 2022.
One of the things that Tony joked about when I interviewed him for season 1 multiple times, and we just talked for season 2 as well, he said that after having this great writer's room and the scripts coming in, he said he couldn't afford to keep you all employed. So he said from that point forward, he was rewriting your scripts, just as you said. And then he said anytime he hit a snag, he would call you, text you, whatever, to just run things by you. Was there ever a time that you remember in season 1 or 2 of doing extensive rewrites for Andor?
I mean, at least for me, I can't speak for Dan and Tom. Right. The bulk of the writing work on my end was the outline and then the first few drafts of the script. And having been on the other side of it where I'm the showrunner, at a certain point, you take over the script. And some showrunners don't do much rewriting and others do a ton. And some of that can vary depending upon what the script needs or production issues. I don't know how much Tony shared, but there are things that we broke at length in in the room that ended up not at all being in the show.
That was going to be my next question, because those are
I
fun
don't
things to
think
hear about.
I don't think I'm at liberty. You can ask Tony again what didn't make its way in, but that's a natural part of the process. So there can be times where, you end up an episode after you've already done your writing, elements of it are completely rethought. And sometimes that's for narrative reasons, as Tony as creator, showrunner, and collaborating with the actors and directors, all that, might find along the way, actually, here's the thing that's working well that I want to lean more into, or here's the thing that's not as important that I thought it was, or a lot of shoe leather that I could use for other things. So naturally, over time, things change. There's always the experience. I had it in season 1, I've had it in season 2, where even in your own episodes, there's things you're seeing. You're like, oh, that's an interesting thing that Tony did there.
Because he's repurposing something that you originally started off meaning something else. I mean, I guess since season 1 is out and complete, I know that there was going to be a little bit more elaboration to the prison break of season 1. Was there anything else that you remember in season 1 that kind of like, the scale and the budget, like, because, Tony said that obviously the impact of shooting under COVID changed things as well from some of the bigger ideas that you guys had. But it is interesting to see a bigger idea boiled down to something more focused.
I'll give you 2 examples in the prison sequence. I mean, so much time and energy was put into exactly what they were building and the exact precise process, and making that very clear to the audience. I don't know if people have covered this on their Reddit threads or what have you, what people think is being built there or what it's being used for. But we knew. But it was these very specific parts for a thing. And I mean, I remember long conversations, even more with Luke Hull at times, where I'm, using some of my visual arts background, I'm doing little sketches and stuff and taking photos of that. And then he comes back 3 days later with a whole rendered beautiful masterpiece of concept art. It was much more involved in terms of like the actual process and the way that the sort of competition worked between the different floors. I'll mention the other example and then tie them together. Also, the breakout itself, the action that took place in terms of the room where Cassian and Kino and others are working, and how choreographed that was, and even the architecture of it and the precise way that they overtook the guards and all of that. I mean, you are drawing maps. You're thinking like, okay, they need to push this button, but if it's up on the catwalk, how are they going to get up there? And maybe you need to use, this pneumatic pipe that you're going to climb up in order to this, but then how many guards? Because one is going to need to rush over from here, and can he make it there by the time they come to intercept? And then what are the people? And then how are they actually going to physically get out of that room? And there was this whole sort of like, are they going to climb through a conveyor belt that takes them to this internal central shed, blah, blah. And you have to think in this sort of obsessive, minute way so that at a certain point you go, you know what? We actually don't need all of that. The main thing here, the audience will buy, like he's going to create a short circuit by running the water in the bathroom. All hell's going to break loose. And then what is the most dramatic and interesting thing? That the Vanguard gets up to the control center, and it's more about convincing people to revolt and Kino coming into his own. That was always going to be a part of it. But all of the sort of accoutrement to get there, I think was, smartly, Tony decided we don't need all of those elements. We just need to get the ball rolling and then let the sort of momentum and passion and uprising take center stage. And so these things just become simplified, just in terms of the pacing. And other times, and I think in this case, it's probably true, what was already a very complex and high production value and complicated thing, let's reduce some of the elements so that we can put most of our focus on performance and storytelling.
The importance of having Luke present has really helped Tony visualize, and I think it's important for a writer to be able to understand their space. And one of the concepts that's always worked for Star Wars is having very lived-in spaces that seem realistic even though they're futuristic. That's something that is interesting to hear, in which, yes, get it all out there, write the most complicated version first, and then you have so much material to whittle it down because of that old adage, nothing is truly written so much as it's rewritten, that allows you to get to an even more perfect moment.
Cole's a genius. And I mean, what's great about Luke is not just the big sort of epic conception of, say, a giant prison complex, but the details too. He's a guy that thinks about tchotchkes on someone's desk, at the ISB as much as weights and standards. I don't think there's many tchotchkes at the ISB, but he thinks about those things. Like, I think one of the most terrifying things about the prison is the design of those prison cells that have no bars, where, I mean, even just like the sadness of getting your non-tasting gruel through that little little, hose
Right.
is kind of in some ways as terrifying and soul crushing as the idea of being sort of fried alive through electro-tungsten floors. And that's what Luke brings to the table that's so extraordinary. You think on this grand scale and the very minute, and that makes it feel real. That's true world building.
Well, I think we've reached the point where we have to get into the spoilers for season
Okay.
2. So, podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all of these Zoomcasts. That's right. You could see Beau and I speaking right now. If you have not yet watched season 2, episodes 4 through 6, press pause. They're on Disney Plus, and come back because we are going to get into the spoilers now. I want to start right off the bat because you have a great arc here with Bix, and you see that she is still suffering PTSD from her torture under Gorst, and she even feels bad in this dream that we see her have about a soldier who, Cassian decided saw too much, saw her face, and needed to die. It's something that happens off screen, which is the other fun trick that you and the crew are playing with this season by skipping a year forward for each batch of 3 episodes. There's such a rich life of things that are happening off screen. Tell me about designing this arc for Bix, which shows her delving into drugs to kind of forget her trauma, but then finally able to come out of it when they go and kill Dr. Gorst, which happens in your episodes and was, very satisfying for a fan to see that she submitted him to the same torture device that he submitted her to.
Bix is one of the richest characters that Tony invented, and certainly the relationship that you begin to see between Bix and Cassian in season 2 was really great traumatic territory to dive into. If the first season of Andor was the education of Cassian Andor, and we meet all these other people along the way, I think season 2, and this is not a Tony approved message, so but I think you would agree with it. I would characterize it as, what is the cost of rebellion? What is the cost? And that's sort of in the shadow of where we all know we're headed, which is Rogue One, that a lot of people have to make sacrifices in order for rebellion to launch. You can see that on a grand scale in terms of, say, the prison arc in season 1, how many people are being affected by this oppressive regime. But it's also important to really make it relatable on a personal scale. And through Bix, I think more than almost any other character in some ways, in a consistent way in season 2, you're seeing what the cost of devoting your life to this is. And I remember Tony really wanting to talk about that arc between Cassian and Bix in episodes 4 through 6 as here, in some ways, they're attempting to live a domestic life. They have their apartment. It happens to be a safe house. Like, they go shopping for groceries, but they have to be really careful when they do it. How do you manage some semblance of humanity under these incredibly high stakes, and when you never know what's around the corner and you're always looking over your shoulder and you're dealing with the PTSD and trauma that comes from the work that you're doing? That in some ways, if we had Luthen Rael say in season 1 that he is given everything, that he essentially is a shadow, he doesn't have a life, that he will never even see the fruits of his labors, that here you're seeing that sort of mid-process with 2 people that are trying to make the bare minimum of love and sanity work for them. And so her arc during those 3 episodes is really trying to delve into that in a way that feels very human and heartbreaking, but also has the satisfaction by the end of it, of that arc, seeing how the work is its own salvation. She is literally able to destroy her demon. That doesn't necessarily mean that all the nightmares are going to go away or that every wound is completely healed, but it sure as hell helps.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you were talking about Luthen has given up everything. Bix has a line where she says, if I have to give up everything, I want to at least win. And that was in her episode. And I thought that was another great line that, echoes what Luthen had said as well.
The first time you see Cassian Andor, he kills a comrade because that guy's not going to be able to escape in time and it's too dangerous to leave him alive. That moment in Rogue One has informed so many moments along the way in Andor. The story you're talking about where she is shaken by, someone dying off screen because they knew too much, that's the world that Andor lives in. And it all all pointing towards, I think, that very first scene we see with Cassian in the movie.
People don't talk about that scene enough because it is a definite departure in tone in the Star Wars universe, because, usually if you're part of the Rebel Alliance, you want to do everything possible to help each other. But no, you're right. He just kills this injured comrade because he wants to keep moving the ball forward, and he fears that this person might not be able to, which, by the way, could be an incorrect assessment. This person might have been able to get out of there just fine, and they gave Luthen incredibly important information. So being killed immediately because of it is, harsh, but definitely we could see the places where it trickles into the Andor TV show. So as we see Cyril's journey on Gorman, infiltrating the underground for the Empire, he is at one point even wearing a beret. It's calling back, to the partisan French underground of World War II that was working against the Nazis. And it almost seemed like they're speaking French, but it's not French. Could you tell us about creating this language and also the subplot that's going on in your episodes where we see the infiltration of the underground, and it's devastating to watch because we know that Cyril is going to betray them. We feel bad that the Gormans are going to have to bite the bullet on everything and not win.
It is an invented language, but it's definitely French adjacent. And from the earliest conversations about Gorman, I remember Tony talking about that he wanted to kind of have this sort of French feel, or like the cafe where, we first see Cassian encounter a Gorman underground person. It should have like a Viennese cafe feel, that there is this sort of, European old world. The Gormans are described as having a sort of, an arrogance that the rest of the galaxy kind of, is miffed by. And, what do they make? They make twill, making luxury fabrics. The French aspect was something that was there from the beginning. I didn't make up the language. Tony did that with some genius person because we wrote everything in English. So that was devised later. In terms of the parallels to the French resistance during World War II, that's pretty clear and obvious. I don't think that anything in Andor is meant to be an exact parallel or comparison to anything else. Influenced by, absolutely. I mean, you're working sort of in that kind of vernacular.
Ooh, hey, I just wanted to remind you really quick about today's sponsor and to check out the regular deadline for Final Draft's Big Break Screenwriting Contest, which is May 19th, 2025. You can enter now for the possibility to share in over $80,000 in cash and prizes. Winners and finalists have signed with agents and managers, sold and optioned screenplays, and been staffed in TV writers' rooms. Look, all you got to do is ask yourself, is this the year for your big break? Find out more about the Big Break Screenwriting Contest by visiting finaldraft.com. And while you're surfing around online, I hope you check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net or via our iPad app Backstory. It's our 13th year, and we couldn't have done it without you. And folks, there's a ton of great articles to see over at backstory.net, whether you look at our free blog or our free issue, or you become a subscriber and get access to all the screenplays that we've published with screenwriting interviews, director interviews, showrunner interviews, playwright interviews, comic book writer interviews. There is a ton going on over at Backstory. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these Zoomcasts. It would really mean a lot to me to have you consider continuing to support independent entertainment journalism. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our interview with screenwriter Beau Willimon, chatting about Andor Season 2, Episodes 4 through 6, which you could watch right now on Disney+. It's interesting that Partagas, he tells them that he wants to give the Resistance a win so they could see what victory tastes like, because he really wants to continue to have this reason to crack down on Gorman, and I thought that was really expertly planted.
Dedra really plants the seed, right? I mean, she goes, you need, an act of rebellion you can count on.
And insurgency you could count on to fail.
See, the lines
to do the wrong thing. Yeah, I just had interviewed Tony about it. Insurgency you could count on to always do the wrong thing. But you're using your expertise as kind of a political writer, as you're seeing Mon Mothma later on this, Senate celebration day, and she's kind of navigating the hallways. We're seeing that she's trying to raise awareness for the people of Gorman and is getting absolutely nowhere with it. And you have this great cross-cutting of the heist of the armory, cross-cut against the removal of the bug. And I'm just curious, what was the challenge of that, if you could boil it down to something? Because it really kept a great echo going back and forth between those two moments, and it heightened the action, the tension, and I thought it was pulled off really well.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the Senate looms large in Star Wars lore, but when you think about it, there's scant times where we've really seen the Senate at work. What does that look like? And it's something I do know a little bit about from my background, and we had to do lots of sort of sequences like this in House of Cards. I told Tony that we had a thing called the lobtage in House of Cards. It's like, so take, it's like montage, but with lobbying. How do you sort of jump between trying to convince different people in different ways, seduction, persuasion, intimidation, what have you, to sort of drum up the votes. And we wanted to do that with Mon Mothma on a pretty esoteric thing called the PORD, the PORD, which was essentially the resentencing directive that resulted in lots of people getting arrested and being extended. And this seems like a sort of bellwether moment, which, are we going to let the burgeoning empire sort of run rampant over civil liberties, or are we going to stop it? Now, it's always tough to make those sort of things in something that's as big and epic as Star Wars feel as exciting as a heist, or trying to remove a bug, but in cross-cutting all of these things. Now, I mean, the lobtage happens before those two things, but you start to create a momentum where you're saying the rebellion exists in many flavors. And I think you see it even more in season 2 than season 1. Everything from Saw Gerrera out in the hinterlands being, just shy of insanity, to a Mon Mothma, trying to sweet talk people on the Senate floor. And that it lives in all of these places simultaneously, and all of these things are happening at the same time and influencing and affecting one another. I mean, I remember that the cross-cutting between the heist on Gorman and the Davos Skolden party where they got to remove the bug was always a conception from the very beginning in the Soho Grand of how can we take the sort of on the ground, in the streets, gritty, inexperienced people making a move for the first time with a little expert help, in the shadows and putting their lives on the line against, sort of people that are working and rubbing shoulders, the upper echelon, and just the deliciousness of like Luthen being in the same room as Krennic.
Right. And then the joke afterwards where they're like, we could have just killed him, right? Because that was very funny because Clea said that.
It's also an attempt to say the stakes, some have more action and blasters than others, but the stakes of each of all of those places are the same. Yeah. Which is people pushing all the chips into the middle of the table, whether it's the halls of the Senate or whether it's the streets of Gorman, or whether it's a rhydominium pipeline out in the middle of nowhere. And writing for Saw Gerrera is always a blast.
Well, it was funny because the scene with Saw and Will, I've just got to ask, your name is Beau Willimon and his name is Wilmon Pack. Was that a tribute to you when that name came up in season 1?
I did not come up with that name. I am not that much of a narcissist.
I know you wouldn't have, but was that something that Tony did and told you?
I think I only registered the Wilmon portion in season 2. I think the first might have been and I was like, what are you doing? You can't do this. I mean, it's too close. He's like, it's done. It's done. That's his name. And I was like, people are going to think that I tried to name a character after myself. And he's like, thing. And then, I mean, my first name legally is Pack, P-A-C-K, Beauregard Wilmon. So
it was you the whole time, sir. It was you the whole time.
Pack, and I'm like, what have you done? And if it is in any way him sort of, drawing from my name and memorializing it in a Star Wars character, I can't help but be incredibly honored and blessed because, I mean, how many people would diehard Star Wars fans would give up a digit in order to have it? And at the same time, deeply embarrassed because I don't want people to think that I was the genesis.
Well, we set the record straight. It wasn't you. It was.
I do have to say, if
it was Tony's
character,
tribute.
Yeah, if there was a character at all that a tribute like that, I'm truly honored because I think Wilmon's a super cool character. I mean, it's sort of like a Cassian mini-me, someone who hails from Ferrix and is willing to, put it all on the line.
I mean, there's so many interesting things happening in that episode, and one of the advantages of skipping forward a year between between these 3 episodes is we never see the end of what they're even doing out in the middle of nowhere, Will and Saw. We don't fully ever get to understand how it even matches into the bigger machinations of what's going on.
What they're doing is siphoning a fuel called Rido. So when he's giving that speech about smelling the Rido, it's a sort of special hyperjet fuel that we researched but kind of made up, and so that we've added that to the canon, I suppose. But also, and I don't know how many people might pick up on this. Of course, in Rogue One, you see Saw Gerrera. But this became an origin story for that mask, which is that breathing in this Rido, I love the smell of napalm in the morning, breathing in, sucking in, and burning your lungs justifies why he eventually, by the time we get to Rogue One, needs that mask to breathe. But also, in an episode where you're seeing, say, Bix deal with a kind of threatening insanity, and you see the pressure that Mon Mothma's under, and you see Cassian really worried about how careless things might be getting. Saw is this sort of, he's batshit crazy, but there's a purity to him, which is, he says to women, you are here, you are doing the thing.
Yeah.
Literally breathe it in. And he repeats this theme. None of us will live to see it, but you are here. I remember I got tingles when we first discussed it in the room, which is this idea of living life to its fullest by being on that edge and having righteous purpose. But what you mentioned about you don't necessarily fully see how arcs like that play out, that's by design. There are beginning, middle, and the end storylines in these blocks, but Tony always wanted to give the impression that we're catching a glimpse, a moment in a thing that's continuous, always on the move. There's always something that's happened just before we can't come into a block, and it's going to happen after it, and we're getting these snapshots, so it doesn't feel like just these islands.
It's always fun when the audience is just a hair ahead of your characters sometimes, and we are, because we see Cassian tell Luthen straight up, Gorman's not going to work. They're not ready. They're too eager. They're rushing it. Those are all the things he says, and he's like, we should not do it. And Luthen says, even if they fail, it'll be noticed by everyone, and we have to stay on board. And Cassian literally checks out, something you don't see a hero do too often. We know that he is checking out for the right reason, because we are seeing, Cyril and the plant in the insurgency that we know is going to be betrayed. And it's fascinating because you have the death of Senta when they have their first major action, because Val and Senta are brought in and have this one night of reunification after being apart for a while. It was a good emotional punch, and fascinating that it is not the name character of your show going through this. It's somebody else in the organization, which I think adds a great sense of depth and layering.
There's these ripple effects, right? Because Cassian wouldn't oversee it himself, that means Vel has to get involved. Vel says, I won't do it unless you bring Cinta in.
Right.
And so she's going to have to live with, that guilt of having brought in, but Cinta wouldn't do it unless Vel was there either, right? And I think it's this way that the sort of human side of things, like the best of Lecare, we all have a mission, but within that mission, our loves, our desire, our personal motivations are coloring every choice that we make. And then, I think the hard reality that sometimes someone like Cinta, who is a true and utter badass, every word Vel says about her at the end of the episode, she's a miracle. She will be mourned in ways that you can't possibly imagine, is true. And yet the way she died was friendly fire by an inexperienced person that was just doing his first mission, and seems like the least glorious possible way to go. And yet in Vel's memory of her, and us, hopefully at this point, if you're a fan of Andor, realizing that that these people, as Tony's always said, are the gravel paving the road to revolution, that they will all be forgotten, that none of them are actually doing it for glory. And for that very reason, they're all glorious. And any way that any of them goes is glorious. It's just one that's for themselves and a small immediate circle of people that know that they even existed. What makes her death so grand is not the way it happened, but the way that Vel characterizes it, which comes from a deep place not only of admiration and respect, but most importantly, love.
Was there ever a time that you remember Tony having you rewrite something on these 3 episodes? Something that you remember coming back to really important, like later after you had turned them in, when they were in various stages of production, or more importantly, because Tony talked about it, the post-production shoots. reboots that they did, the reshoots, because the strike happened in the middle. And I know I am talking to a two-time president of the WGA East, so we could spend a whole episode talking about the meaning of the strike, but we don't have that kind of time. Tell us something that was rewritten that was an interesting lesson for you.
At a certain point, Tony was really doing most of the rewriting himself. There might have been a few phone calls where he, called to pick my brain about, there was a whole lot of stuff that had to be figured out with the heist. I mean, at one point, the heist was going to be a totally different type of heist, completely, totally different. And then we kind of did, we're like, no, that's becoming too overwrought and sweaty. Let's make it much more focused on and connect it to the annex and, make it much more sort of, gritty and sort of in the shadows. Things that I remember us spending a lot of time on is the scenes between Cassian and Bix, which really did need to feel like Le Carre. Very sparse dialogue, much more about moments and atmosphere and these little sort of nuanced turns, and it being, much more kind of what's happening on faces and sort of micro geography and choreography within the room. Tony's so great, and he brings it out of all of the people that he works with of these incredibly powerful speeches and clever, lines and stuff like that. But sometimes you want very simple, sparse, emotional moments. And that's sometimes harder to write. So we really had to get that right. One thing that actually proved to be more difficult than it seems is when we first make our way into Gorman, into the city, Cyril takes us there, kind of walks through the town square and into the building and all of that. And it was all going to be just visual at first, which was, just a kind of montage, probably with music of him making his way through the town. And even at the script stage, Tony was like, I think it needs more. We need to somehow give it more color and texture. And we knew he was going to get to speaking to Edie, his mom, kind of on the phone. But what if we started putting that conversation over the montage as he made his way to work? That actually took a lot of writing to sort of, how do you match what they're talking about on the phone to what you're seeing? And this is the sort of grinding craftsmanship that goes into, hopefully feels effortless by the time it's all edited together, but can, eat up a lot of time and energy to kind of get that sort of dance right.
And I love hearing about that. And, your introduction of Varian Sky, that alternate personality for Cassian was great. Two last questions. One is lightning fast, just yes or no. Was there ever anything more about the Hollow News buyout? Because you are just scratching the surface of state-run media, and we see it in your episodes a few places, and I'm just curious if there was ever more to that. And then the last question is, what was your toughest scene?
The short answer is yes, there was a bit more to it, but I don't think there was much more. In general, there's more to everything.
Sure.
Because the process of making the show is sort of shaving it down and getting to its essence. So you work out everything kind of 150% so that you can get down to 100%. But I think a nod to that was something that we wanted to do. And all that was needed, as Tony realized, was a nod.
Seeing that they're reporting differently from what's going on Gorman tells you everything you need to know. But what was your toughest scene, and how did you creatively solve that challenge? And then I know we're running out of time.
Two of the toughest scenes, I think one was, what exactly do we want to see for Bix's nightmare? Because a lot of emotional weight hangs on that. And I'm a pretty visual guy, so I love writing stuff like that because it's pure cinema. But we went through a lot of different versions. Ultimately ended up becoming simpler and simpler, but there were much more, I think, David Lynchian, really out there versions of that. That takes time to sort of figure out what you want that language to be. But I think where it ended up is great. And then the Saw Gerrera speech just took a lot of passes because it's one of those, when Forrest Whitaker's, whatever you give him, he's going to make amazing, and you owe it to him and you owe it to the character. And it's kind of a thesis for his way of thinking, and one of those places where you're really talking directly to the audience about the rebellion. They're fun to write because Saw is such a juicy character. It really is like writing poetry. You have every word and pause and comma matters because you're giving him center stage. You got to make it right.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating too because you're talking about his experiences as a youth on Andor, and you're filling in gaps that even the animated series hadn't hit. It was a great speech. That was fantastic. Well, is there anything you want to tell us that you're working on next before we go?
A little bit of this, a little bit of that. I got some irons in the fire and some stuff I've been working on for a while, but it's nice to watch the show get launched and see everyone enjoying it as much as they are, and really appreciate the amount of time you're devoting to talking about it. Being able to talk in depth is a lot of fun, and I hope the fans appreciate that.
Well, thanks for your time, and I absolutely love what's going on in season 2 of Andor, and these 3 episodes were fantastic. fantastic. So congrats on that, and congrats on becoming a character in the Star Wars universe, sir. Not many people get to do that, as you've said. But thanks again for your time, and I can't wait to see what we find out in our next episode discussing Andor. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to screenwriter Beau Willimon for being so generous with his time and coming down to chat about Andor Season 2, Episodes 4 through 6. And folks, I also hope you'll give some love to our sponsor. The regular deadline for Final Draft's Big Break Screenwriting Contest is May 19th, 2025. You could enter now for the possibility to share in over $80,000 in cash and prizes. Winners and finalists have signed with agents and managers, sold and optioned screenplays, and been staffed in TV writers' rooms. All you got to do is ask yourself, is this the year for your big break? Find out more about the Big Break Screenwriting Contest and visit finaldraft.com to enter. And folks, while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. This is our 13th year as a magazine, and we couldn't have done it without you. If you want to test drive us, you could always read our free issue over there or via our iPad app, Backstory. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off a 1-year subscription. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all of these Zoomcasts. That's right, you could see Beau and I chatting. It would really mean a lot to me to have you consider supporting independent entertainment journalism. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is the copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2025. All rights reserved. And folks, if you want to drop me a line, you could do so at any time. You could find me on Blue Sky as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag, or on Twitter as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag, or on Instagram as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag. Do you see a trend here? I also have a Facebook fan page, which is an easy place to find me. Or if you want to go old school, you could even send me an email, backstoryletters@gmail.com. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.